Eureka Seven is a 2005 Japanese television series animated by Studio Bones, and despite my first impressions, I think it holds up exceptionally well. I used to think the show was kind of weird, and that's probably because I only watched the English dub at first, but now that I've rewatched the whole franchise with Japanese audio, I think that I finally get it now. As much as I enjoy the fact that this series features giant robots on surfboards with a bunch of early 2000s aesthetics that absolutely nail the style of Surfer magazine and remind me of how I spent my summers going to swim lessons and day camp at the local community center while reading extreme sports magazines in the waiting area, what really speaks to me now isn't so much the nostalgia or the aesthetics, but the themes and ideals behind them. How the anime speaks out against military regimes and solidarity with grassroots revolutionaries, youth counterculture, and ecological activism. Eureka 7 isn't just a nostalgia trip, it's a political statement about the environment and why we should care for it. In a world where people surf through the air on transparent light particles, a 14-year-old boy named Renton Thurston has his life suddenly change when he falls in love with a turquoise-haired girl named Eureka, becomes the co-pilot of her giant robot, and joins his favorite organization of surfing celebrities known as the Gecko State. Only to discover that their purpose isn't just to surf on trapper waves or sell magazines, but to defend their planet from a military that is bringing harm to it. Every landmass in the world of Eureka 7 is covered by a sentient organism known as scub coral, which produces the trapper waves and has the power to warp reality itself, even to the point where it could destroy the entire universe. Which is why the coral have placed themselves in a self-induced hibernation, and why the human military that is attacking the scub coral needs to be stopped. They're not making life easier for humanity, they're escalating the situation and making it worse for everyone. Because if the scub coral are woken up, it could mean the collapse of reality as we know it. On one side, you have the Gecko State leader, Holland Novak, a man who defected from the military after learning the truth, and on the other side, you have his older brother, Dewey Novak, a man who leads the military in its efforts to conquer the planet with brute force, sacrificing innocent human lives and jeopardizing the fate of the world in the process. If you destroy the scub coral, you risk destroying everything else. And if this is your first time hearing that in plain terms, I don't blame you, because Eureka 7 is way too cryptic for its own good. So much of the show's dialogue sounds like it's written in code, with hyper-specific jargon being thrown around like the second summer of love, the limit of questions, or references to a book called The Golden Bough, which isn't intriguing to the audience. It's confusing, because we don't always understand what those terms actually mean. In Eureka 7, it's really important to know that the Summer of Love just means a time of prosperity for humanity, that the limit of questions just refers to the impending collapse of reality if the scub coral become overwhelmed, and The Golden Bough is just a book that studies common themes among religions. Because once you have this context, the series starts to make a lot more sense. Much like how Alfred Hitchcock says that a scene where the audience already knows about a ticking time bomb underneath the kitchen table is far more dramatic than a scene where a bomb suddenly explodes out of nowhere, having the context and dramatic clarity for what is going on in Eureka 7 makes the episodes way more enjoyable, even to the point where rewatching the series can actually be better than your first time through. Once you know what happened during Holland's childhood, it finally makes sense why he refers to Dewey as the one who killed the king. And once you know that Renton is the younger brother of Holland's ex-girlfriend that he's still hung up over, suddenly you understand why Holland is so awkward around the Thurstons, as well as why he still views Renton as the snot-nosed brat who almost ruined Holland's first date. I mean, you probably still don't like Holland at this point, but even that is by design. You're supposed to kinda not like him. You're supposed to view the character as a flawed human being who needs to stop running away from his guilt and finally tell Renton what's going on. A lot of things that happen in this show might seem weird at first glance, but they honestly serve a real, actual purpose in Eureka 7. The fact that Eureka is a mother to 3 children might seem strange at first, but knowing that she adopted them to atone for what she did as a child soldier gives you a lot of insight into her character. The rival antagonist Anemone might seem out of her mind, but then you realize that she's only like that because she's hopped up on medication. The episode where you meet a guy living in the middle of nowhere with his comatose wife isn't some throwaway filler episode, it's where Renton gets to see what true devotion in a relationship looks like. And the episode with the dying Vodarak girl is actually one of the most important stories in the entire series because it's where Renton realizes that he hasn't really been considering Eureka's feelings, that he needs to think more about how he's actually going to help her. As much as the show keeps saying, don't beg for things, do it yourself, or you won't get anything, that's not really in the same spirit of what the rest of the show is saying. Eureka 7 isn't about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or getting it by your hands, it's about emotional maturity. It's about Renton learning to actually think about what Eureka wants instead of being enamored with her all the time. About him learning to read in between the lines and look past the surface level of things. It's about Holland opening up to people and finally bothering to tell Renton what's actually going on, as well as being about how Eureka is literally developing her emotions and realizing that she might have feelings for Renton. There's a romance plot, but the characters aren't immediately a couple, they have to grow into that point. They have to grow closer together, figure things out, experience hardships and disagreements, all so as to navigate a relationship that is authentic to real life. Eureka 7 is trying to make genuine, authentic statements about the real world. The scub coral are a metaphor for planet Earth, where if we don't properly care for our planet, we all face the destructive consequences of climate change. The gecko state represent the revolutionary-minded youth who are on the right side of history. The Vodarak represent people from Eastern religions that are often treated unfairly, be they Buddhist, Muslim, or Jewish. And the conquering, colonizing military of Eureka 7 is just like how our militaries in the real world are the biggest sources of pollution. What with the sheer amount of fuel consumed, explosives detonated, and waste generated even when they're not at war. This isn't your traditional hypermasculine giant robot anime where the heroes always win through brute force. It's a giant robot anime for a new age, where the main hero needs to learn how to be more considerate, where the conflict is a metaphor for the environment, and where it's better to communicate with people rather than force your way through everything. But unfortunately, not every aspect of Eureka 7 seems to understand this. As cool as it is to watch the main robot basically turn into Gunbuster during the final episode, the way that the main character forces his way through obstacles all on his own kind of feels at odds with what the show has been saying so far. And the first Eureka 7 movie from 2009 isn't much better either, because in my book, there are so many bizarre decisions taking place in the film that it almost single-handedly killed my motivation to make an Eureka 7 video when I first watched it a few years ago. The 2017 film Eureka 7 High Evolution, however, is a different story. Because with that film, you get a prologue set before the original series, where we get to watch Renton's father save the world, and it's done in this high-definition, widescreen animation that looks really good and gets you excited for what the rest of the movie is going to be like, until you learn that the actual meat of the film is just the compilation movie with the old standard definition format and what looks like the exact same animation cells from the TV show, in what is supposed to be a theatrical experience. Instead of covering the inciting incident of the original series, High Evolution covers the Ray and Charles arc from like episode 22 onward, which I can kind of understand because it is where Renton's character goes through the most dramatic changes, but it's still far from the kind of story I would want for the first movie in a 3-part trilogy. If I really wanted to get someone on board with Eureka 7, I would focus on adapting the story of Renton living among the Gecko State, the story of the put-upon rookie trying to prove himself to the adults that he looks up to, because in my book, it's the most iconic part of the series and also the most suited to be a standalone theatrical adaptation that anyone can enjoy even if they haven't seen Eureka 7 before. Now, we do get a standalone movie in the form of the 2018 film Eureka 7 High Evolution Anemone, and even though it is not a sequel to the first High Evolution film at all, seeing as though it takes a bonkers left turn into the territory of alternate universes, I still kind of respect it, because the change in aspect ratios actually has a stylistic purpose this time, and I actually kinda like seeing Anemone as a hero with more internal characterization. She might be a completely different character than who she was in the anime, and the film might start out with her fighting against Eureka, but it ends up with the two characters ultimately coming together, where Anemone chooses open communication over brute force, a choice that feels like it's in agreement with the themes of the original series. Of course, there's also the 2012 sequel series Eureka 7 AO Astral Ocean, where Eureka's biological son, Ao Fukai, is living on a parallel universe in which scub coral and trapper waves exist on a contemporary planet Earth as like an alternate history scenario. And while this makes for a more grounded narrative, it's a premise that can be difficult to accept if you were anticipating Eureka 7 The Next Generation, or something that would have actually focused on the future of the Gecko State members, which is honestly a perfectly natural expectation. Astral Ocean has a fantastic soundtrack by Koji Nakamura, a solid main character, and seeing a new Nirvash robot flying around an island is a really cool image, but now that I've rewatched this series, I found a lot of things in here that I don't really like. And I'm not just talking about how it does a lot of creepy stuff with the female characters, or all the painfully unfunny anime references. Where the protagonists of the original Eureka 7 operated as a countercultural grassroots anti-establishment movement, the protagonists of the sequel work for a bureaucratic rescue company with enough resources for their headquarters to be its own city, which doesn't seem to be within the same spirit to me. Like, if you were going to make an Eureka 7 story set in a more contemporary society, the real-world equivalent of the Gecko State would be more like indie magazine publications, climate change activists, and leftist anti-military revolutionaries fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples. You know, like the kind of people who would actually cosplay Che Guevara. Given how Eureka's son was raised on an island within the Okinawa region, an area that has been occupied by both the United States military as well as the Japanese government, and whose people are one of the most discriminated racial minorities in Japanese society, you'd think that the Okinawan independence movement would be like the sequel's version of the Gecko State. But instead, they're minor antagonists. Nearly everyone on the island pretty much hates Eureka's family and blames her for the misfortune they've suffered following her arrival. And while this makes us sympathize with the protagonist more, the fact that a group of people who are victims of racism in the real world are being cast in an anime as racist against outsiders kind of positions us against them and their cause as a whole. Like, imagine if an American cartoon featured an outsider protagonist living in Hawaii and being subject to racism by the native Hawaiians who want their islands to be an independent country. It just seems a little, biased. Granted, the show does make a point to also frame the Japanese and the United States military in a negative light, which is valid, but I don't think that the portrayals are as nuanced as the show thinks they are, because instead of feeling like a complex, multifaceted issue, it feels more like all these adults are just being petty and can't let go of the past. Eureka 7 Astral Ocean follows the consequences of the Scub Coral traveling to an alternate universe where they end up being attacked not by humanity, but by that universe's natural defense system. And while the show ultimately sides with the Scub Coral during the last few minutes, all the different plot elements feel more disconnected from each other rather than being in service of a specific thematic message. The problem with Astral Ocean isn't that it's different or not leftist enough, the problem is that it's not in tune with the values that the original Eureka 7 stood for. Instead of the Scub Coral continuing to be a metaphor for the environment, they're treated like literal aliens without any of the previous subtext. Its depiction of politics is more complicated, but much less of a coherent statement. It treats the Okinawans who want independence like they're superstitious bigots, and no, a 30-year-old Renton Thurston should not be trying to destroy the Scub Coral in any universe, no matter what contrived, tragic backstory the show cooked up to also justify its own premise. Even if the show is trying to say that it's better to accept compromises on your ideals so that you don't lose them entirely, that still feels out of touch with what the original Eureka 7 had to say about the environment. Like, how can there be a compromise on the world ending versus it not ending? It's funny, back when I first made my way through this franchise, I thought that the original series was weird and actually liked the premise of Astral Ocean more, but now I'm the complete opposite. I used to think that my favorite aspects of the original were the early 2000s aesthetics, but now I care a whole lot more about the themes and messages that Eureka 7 was trying to say, to the point where I'm really disappointed that none of the subsequent media has ever done the Gecko State justice or even bothered to include them at all. And the older I get, the more I realize that all the 20-something adults living with their friend group on an airship where they make counterculture magazines and subvert the military were actually living the dream. I still think that the series would be a lot better if it was structured so that the audience knew about certain things ahead of time, but that's all the more reason why I want a real Eureka 7 movie adaptation that anyone can enjoy even if they haven't seen the original. Or at least something that distills the real themes and iconic imagery of the series into one package. Because with all these different parts of the franchise that seem to be in conflict with each other, I feel like we need to collectively refresh our memory on what made the series so great. Stop quoting the "don't beg for things" mantra, start looking at what the show was actually saying. Because what really made Eureka 7 so great wasn't just the music, the art style, or the animation, it was the statements and ideals behind them. How it said that the military was wrong, and that the young, environmentally concerned revolutionaries were right. How it said that we need to take better care of the environment, communicate with others, and be more considerate to truly achieve emotional maturity. I used to think it was weird, and I guess it kind of still is, but after all this time, I think I finally understand Eureka 7.